Arthur Dent very much hoped, for an unworthy moment, as they drifted up, that his friends, who had always found him pleasant but dull, or, more latterly, odd but dull, were having a good time in the pub. But that was the last time for a while that he thought of them. They drifted up, spiraling slowly around each other, like sycamore seeds falling from sycamore trees in the autumn, except going the other way. As they drifted up, their minds sang with the ecstatic knowledge that either what they were doing was completely and utterly and totally impossible, or that physics had a lot of catching up to do. Physics shook its head and, looking the other way, concentrated on keeping the cars going along the Euston Road and out toward the Westway flyover, on keeping the streetlights lit, and on making sure that when somebody in Baker Street dropped a cheeseburger, it went splat upon the ground. Dwindling heavily beneath them, the beaded strings of lights of London. London, Arthur had to keep reminding himself, not the strangely colored fields of cricket or the remote fringes of the galaxy, lighted freckles of which faintly spanned the opening sky above. But London swayed, swaying, and turned. "Try a swoop," he called to Fenchurch. "What?" Her voice seemed strangely clear, but distant in all the vast empty air. It was breathy and faint with disbelief. All those things, clear, faint, distant, breathy, all at the same time. "We're flying," she said. "A trifle," called Arthur. "Think nothing of it. Try a swoop." "A swoop?" Her hand caught his, and in a sudden second her weight caught it too, and stunningly she was gone, tumbling beneath him, clawing wildly at nothing. Physics glanced at Arthur, and, clotted with horror, he was gone too, sick with giddy dropping, every part of him screaming but his voice. So they plummeted because this was London, and you really couldn't do this sort of thing here. He couldn't catch her because this was London, and not a million miles from here. 756, to be exact, in Pisa, where Galileo had clearly demonstrated that two falling bodies fell at exactly the same rate of acceleration, irrespective of their relative weights. They fell. Arthur realized as he fell, giddily and sickeningly, that if he was going to hang around in the sky believing everything that the Italians had to say about physics, when they couldn't even keep a simple tower straight, that they were in dead trouble, and he damn well did fall faster than Fenchurch. He grappled her from above and fumbled for a tight grip on her shoulders. He got it. Fine. They were now falling together, which was all very sweet and romantic, but it didn't solve the basic problem, which was that they were falling, and the ground wasn't waiting to see if he had any more clever tricks up his sleeve. But he was coming up to meet them like an express train. He couldn't support her weight. He hadn't anything he could support it with or against. The only thing he could think was that they were obviously going to die, and if he wanted anything other than the obvious to happen, he was going to have to do something other than the obvious. Here, he felt he was in familiar territory. He let go of her, pushed her away, and when she turned to face him in a gasp of stunned horror, caught her little finger with his little finger and swung her back upward, tumbling clumsily after her. "Shit," she said, as she sat panting and breathless on absolutely nothing at all. And when she had recovered herself, they fled up on into the night. Just below cloud level, they paused and scanned where they had impossibly come. The ground was something not to regard with any too firm or steady eye, but merely to glance at, as it were, in passing. Fenchurch tried some little swoops, daringly, and found that if she judged herself right against a body of wind, she could pull off some really quite dazzling ones with a little pirouette at the end, followed by a little drop which made her dress billow around her. And this is where readers who are keen to know what Marvin and Ford Prefect have been up to all this while should look ahead to later chapters, because Arthur now could wait no longer and helped her take it off. It drifted down and away, whipped by the wind, until it was a speck which finally vanished, and for obvious complicated reasons revolutionized the life of a family in Hounslow, over whose washing line it was discovered draped in the morning. In a mute embrace, they drifted up till they were swimming among the misty wraiths of moisture that you can see feathering around the wings of an airplane, but never feel because you are sitting warm inside the stuffy airplane and looking through the little scratchy plexiglass window, while somebody else's son tries patiently to pour warm milk into your shirt. Arthur and Fenchurch could feel them, wispy and cold and thin, wreathing round their bodies, very cold, very thin. They felt, even Fenchurch, now protected from the elements only by a couple of fragments from Marx and Spencer, that if they were not going to let the force of gravity bother them, then mere cold or paucity of atmosphere could go and whistle. The two fragments from Marks and Spencer, which, as Fenchurch rose now into the misty body of the clouds, Arthur removed very, very slowly, which is the only way it's possible to do that when you're flying and also not using your hands, went on to create considerable havoc in the morning in, respectively, counting from top to bottom, Isleworth and Richmond. They were in the cloud for a long time because it was stacked very high, and when they finally emerged wetly above it, Fenchurch slowly spinning like a starfish lapped by a rising tide pool, they found that above the clouds is where the night gets seriously moonlit. The light is darkly brilliant. There are different mountains up here, but they are mountains with their own white Arctic snows. They had emerged at the top of the high-stacked cumulonimbus, and now began lazily to drift down its contours. As Fenchurch eased Arthur in turn from his clothes, pried him free of all of them till all were gone, winding their surprised way down into the enveloping whiteness. She kissed him, kissed his neck, his chest, and soon they were drifting on, turning slowly, in a kind of speechless T-shape, which might have caused even a Falornus fire dragon, had one flown past, replete with pizza, to flap its wings and cough a little. There were, however, no Falornus fire dragons in the clouds, nor could there be, for, like the dinosaurs, the dodos, and the greater drubbered windwalk of Steg Bartle Major in the constellation Fraz, and unlike the Boeing 747, which is in plentiful supply, they are sadly extinct, and the universe shall never know their like again. The reason that a Boeing 747 crops up rather unexpectedly in the above list is not unconnected with the fact that something very similar happened in the lives of Arthur and Fenchurch a moment or two later. They are big things, terrifyingly big. You know when one is in the air with you. There is a thunderous attack of air, a moving wall of screaming wind, and you get tossed aside if you are foolish enough to be doing anything remotely like what Arthur and Fenchurch were doing in its close vicinity, like butterflies in the Blitz. This time, however, there was no heart-sickening fall or loss of nerve, just a regrouping moments later and a wonderful new idea enthusiastically signaled through the buffeting noise. Mrs. E. Capelson of Boston, Massachusetts, was an elderly lady. Indeed, she felt her life was nearly at an end. She had seen a lot of it, been puzzled by some, but she was a little bit uneasy to feel at this late stage, bored by too much. It had all been very pleasant, but perhaps a little too explicable, a little too routine. With a sigh, she flipped up the little plastic window shade and looked over the wing. At first, she thought she ought to call the stewardess, but then she thought, no, damn it, definitely not. This was for her, and her alone. By the time the two inexplicable people finally slipped back off the wing and tumbled into the slipstream, she had cheered up an awful lot. She was mostly immensely relieved to think that virtually everything that anybody had ever told her was wrong. The following morning, Arthur and Fenchurch slept very late in the alley, despite the continual wail of furniture being restored. The following night, they did it all over again, only this time with Sony Walkman. Chapter 27. This is all very wonderful, said Fenchurch a few days later, but I do need to know what has happened to me. You see, there's this difference between us, that you lost something and found it again. I found something and lost it. I need to find it again. She had to go out for the day, so Arthur settled down for a day of telephoning. Murray Boast Henson was a journalist on one of the papers with small pages and big print. It would be pleasant to be able to say that he was none the worse for this, but sadly, this was not the case. He happened to be the only journalist that Arthur knew, so Arthur phoned him anyway. Arthur, my old soup spoon, my old silver tureen, how particularly stunning to hear from you. Someone told me you'd gone off into space or something. Murray had his own special kind of conversation language, which he had invented for his own use, and which no one else was able to speak or even to follow. Hardly any of it meant anything at all. The bits which did mean anything were often so wonderfully buried that no one could ever spot them slipping past in the avalanche of nonsense. The time when you did find out, later, which bits he did mean, was often a bad time for all concerned. What? Said Arthur. Just a rumor, my old elephant tusk, my little green baize card table, just a rumor. Probably means nothing at all, but I may need a quote from you. Nothing to say, just pub talk. We thrive on it, my old prosthetic limb, we thrive on it. Plus, it fit like a what's-it in one of those other things with the stories of the week, so it could just be... So it could be good to just have you denying it. Excuse me, something has just fallen out of my ear. There was a slight pause, at the end of which Murray Boast Henson came back on the line, sounding genuinely shaken. Just remembered, he said. What an odd evening I had last night. Anyway, my old I won't say what, how do you feel about having ridden on Halley's Comet? I haven't, said Arthur with a suppressed sigh. Ridden on Halley's Comet. Okay, how do you feel about not having ridden on Halley's Comet? Pretty relaxed, Murray. There was a pause while Murray wrote this down. Good enough for me, Arthur. Good enough for Ethel and me and the chickens. Fits in with the general weirdness of the week. Week of the Weirdos. We're thinking of calling it. Good, eh? Very good. Got a ring to it. First, we have this man it always rains on. What? It's the absolute stocking top truth, all documented in his little black books. It all checks out at every single fun-loving level. The Met Office is going ice-cold thick banana whips, and funny little men in white coats are flying in from all the world with their little rulers and boxes and drip feeds. This man is the bee's knees, Arthur. He is the wasp's nipples. He is, I would go so far as to say, the entire set of erogenous zones of every major flying insect in the Western world. We're calling him the rain god. Nice, eh? I think I've met him. Good ring to it. What did you say? I may have met him. Complains all the time, yes? Incredible. You met the rain god? If it's the same guy. I told him to stop complaining and show someone his book. There was an impressed pause from Murray Boast Henson's end of the phone. Well, you did a bundle. An absolute bundle has absolutely been done by you. Listen, do you know how much a tour operator is paying that guy to not go to Malaga this year? I mean, forget irrigating the Sahara or boring stuff like that. This guy has a whole new career ahead of him, just avoiding places for money. The man's turning into a monster, Arthur. We might even have to make him win the bingo. Listen, we may want to do a feature on you, Arthur. The man who made the rain god rain. Got a ring to it, eh? A nice one, but we may need to photograph you under a garden shower, but that'll be okay. Where are you? I'm in Islington. Listen, Murray, Islington. Yes? Well, what about the real weirdness of the week? The real seriously loopy stuff? You know anything about these flying people? No. You must have. This is the real seethingly crazy one. This is the real meatballs in the batter. Locals are phoning in all the time to say there's this couple who go flying nights. We've got guys down in our photo labs working through the night to put together a genuine photograph. You must have heard. No. Arthur, where have you been? Oh, space, right. I got your quote. But that was months ago. Listen, it's night after night this week, my old cheese grater, right on your patch. This couple just fly around the sky and start doing all kinds of stuff. And I don't mean looking through walls or pretending to be box girder bridges. You don't know anything? No. Arthur, it's been almost inexpressibly delicious conversing with you, chum bum, but I have to go. I'll send the guy with the camera and the hose. Give me the address. I'm ready in writing. Listen, Murray, I called to ask you something. I have a lot to do. I just wanted to find something about the dolphins. No story. Last year's news. Forget them. They're gone. It's important. Listen, no one will touch it. You can't sustain a story, you know, when the only news is the continuing absence of whatever it is the story's about. Not our territory anyway. Try the Sundays. Maybe they'll run a little whatever happened to the dolphins story in a couple of years, around August. But what's anybody going to do now? Dolphins still gone. Continuing dolphin absence. Dolphins. Further days without them. The story dies, Arthur. It lies down and kicks its little feet in the air and presently goes to the great golden spike in the sky, my old fruit bat. Murray, I'm not interested in whether it's a story. I just want to find out how I can get in touch with that guy in California who claims to know something about it. I thought you might know. My accent is wandering all over England today. Chapter 28. People are beginning to talk, said Fenchurch that evening, after they had hauled her cello in. Not only talk, said Arthur, but print in big, bold letters under the bingo prizes, which is why I thought I'd better get these. He showed her the long, narrow booklets of airline tickets. Arthur, she said, hugging him, does that mean you managed to talk to him? I have had a day, said Arthur, of extreme telephonic exhaustion. I have spoken to virtually every department of virtually every paper in Fleet Street, and I finally tracked his number down. You've obviously been working hard. You're drenched with sweat, poor darling. Not with sweat, said Arthur wearily. A photographer's just been here. I tried to argue, but never mind. The point is, yes. You spoke to him. I spoke to his wife. She said he was too weird to come to the phone right now, and could I call back? He sat down heavily, realizing he was missing something, and went to the fridge to find it. Want a drink? Would commit murder to get one. I always know I'm in for a tough time when my cello teacher looks me up and down and says, "Ah, yes, my dear, I think a little Tchaikovsky today." I called again, said Arthur, and she said he was 3.2 light years from the phone, and could I call back? Ah, I called again. She said the situation had improved. He was now a mere 2.6 light years from the phone, but it was still a very long way to shout. You don't suppose, said Fenchurch doubtfully, that there's anyone else we can talk to? It gets worse, said Arthur. I spoke to someone on a science magazine who actually knows him. And he said that John Watson will not only believe, but will actually have absolute proof, often dictated to him by angels with golden beards and green wings and Dr. Scholl footwear, that the month's most fashionable silly theory is true. For people who question the validity of these visions, he will get triumphantly produce the clogs in question, and that's as far as you get. I didn't realize it was that bad, said Fenchurch quietly. She fiddled listlessly with the tickets. I phoned Mrs. Watson again, said Arthur. Her name, by the way, as you may wish to know this, is Arcane Jill. I see. I'm glad you see. I thought you mightn't believe any of this, so when I called her this time, I used the telephone answering machine to record the call with. He went across to the telephone machine and fiddled and fumed with all its buttons for a while, because it was the one which was particularly recommended by Which magazine and is almost impossible to use without going mad. Here it is, he said at last, wiping the sweat from his brow. The voice was thin and crackly with its journey to a geostationary satellite and back, but was also hauntingly calm. Perhaps I should explain, Arcane Jill Watson's voice said, that the phone is in fact in a room that he never comes to. It's in the asylum, you see. Wonko the Sane does not like to enter the asylum, and so he does not. I feel you should know this because it may save you phoning. If you would like to meet him, this is very easily arranged. All you have to do is walk in. He will only meet people outside the asylum. Arthur's voice, at its most mystified, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Where is the asylum? Where is the asylum? Arcane Jill Watson again. Have you ever read the instructions on a packet of toothpicks? On the tape, Arthur's voice had to admit that he had not. You may want to do that. You may find that it clarifies things for you a little. You may find that it indicates to you where the asylum is. Thank you. The sound of the phone line went dead. Arthur turned the machine off. Well, I suppose we can regard that as an invitation, he said with a shrug. I actually managed to get the address from the guy on the science magazine. Fenchurch looked up at him with a thoughtful frown and looked at the tickets again. Do you think it's worth it? She said. Well, said Arthur, the one thing that everyone I spoke to agreed on, apart from the fact that they thought he was barking mad, is that he does know more than any man living about dolphins. Chapter 29. This is an important announcement. This is Flight 121 to Los Angeles. If your travel plans today do not include Los Angeles, now would be a perfect time to disembark. Chapter 30. They rented a car in Los Angeles from one of the places that rents out cars that other people have thrown away. Getting it to go around corners is a bit of a problem, said the guy behind the sunglasses as he handed them the keys. Sometimes it's simpler just to get out and find a car that's going in that direction. They stayed for one night in a hotel on Sunset Boulevard, which someone had told them they would enjoy being puzzled by. Everyone there is either English or odd or both. They've got a swimming pool where you can go and watch English rock stars reading Language, Truth, and Logic for the photographers. It was true. There was one, and that was exactly what he was doing. The garage attendant didn't think much of their car, but that was fine because they didn't either. Late in the evening, they drove through the Hollywood Hills along Mulholland Drive and stopped to look out first over the dazzling sea of floating lights that is Los Angeles, and later stopped to look across the dazzling sea of floating lights that is the San Fernando Valley. They agreed that the sense of dazzle stopped immediately at the back of their eyes and didn't touch any other part of them, and came away strangely unsatisfied by the spectacle. As dramatic seas of light went, it was fine, but light is meant to illuminate something, and having driven through what is particularly dramatic sea of light was illuminating, they didn't think much of it. They slept late and restlessly, and awoke at lunchtime when it was unbearably hot. They drove out along the freeway to Santa Monica for their first look at the Pacific Ocean, the ocean which Wonko the Sane spent all his days and a good deal of his nights looking at. Someone told me, said Fenchurch, that they once overheard two ladies on this beach, doing what we're doing, looking at the Pacific Ocean for the first time in their lives, and apparently, after a long pause, one of them said to the other, "You know, it's not as big as I expected." Their mood gradually lifted as they walked along the beach in Malibu and watched all the millionaires in their chic shanty huts carefully keeping an eye on one another to check how rich they were each getting. Their mood lifted further as the sun began to move down the western half of the sky, and by the time they were back in their rattling car and driving toward a sunset that no one of any sensibility would dream of building a city like Los Angeles in front of, they were suddenly feeling astonishingly and irrationally happy, and didn't even mind that the terrible old car radio would only play two stations, and those simultaneously. What happened? The camera went away. Okay. So what? They were both playing good rock and roll. "I know that he will be able to help us," said Fenchurch determinedly. "I know he will. What's his name again? The one he likes to be called?" "Wonko the Sane." "I know that he will be able to help us." Arthur wondered if he would, and hoped that he would, and hoped that what Fenchurch had lost could be found here, on this earth, whatever this earth might prove to be. He hoped, as he had hoped continually and fervently since the time they had talked together on the banks of the Serpentine, that he would not be called upon to try to remember something that he had very firmly and deliberately buried in the furthest recesses of his memory, where he hoped it would cease to nag at him. In Santa Barbara, they stopped at a fish restaurant in what seemed to be a converted warehouse. Fenchurch had red mullet and said it was delicious. Arthur had a swordfish steak and said it made him angry. He grabbed a passing waitress by the arm and berated her. "Why's this fish so bloody good?" he demanded angrily. "Please excuse my friend," said Fenchurch to the startled waitress. "I think he's having a nice day at last." Chapter 31. If you took a couple of David Bowies and stuck one of the David Bowies on top of the other David Bowie, then attached another David Bowie to the end of each of the arms of the upper of the first two David Bowies, and wrapped the whole business up in a dirty beach robe, you would then have something which didn't exactly look like John Watson, but which those who knew him would find hauntingly familiar. He was tall, and he gangled. When he sat in his desk chair gazing at the Pacific, not so much with any kind of wild surmise any longer as with peaceful, deep dejection, it was a little difficult to tell exactly where the deck chair ended and he began, and you would hesitate to put your hand on, say, his forearm, in case the whole structure suddenly collapsed with a snap and took your thumb off. But his smile, when he turned it on you, was quite remarkable. It seemed to be composed of all the worst things that life can do to you, but which, when he briefly reassembled them in that particular order on his face, made you suddenly feel, "Oh, well, that's all right then." When he spoke, you were glad that he used the smile that made you feel, "Oh, well, that's all right then," pretty often. "Oh, yes," he said. "They come and see me. They sit right here. They sit right where you're sitting." He was talking of the angels with the golden beards and the green wings and the Dr. Scholl's sandals. "They eat nachos, which they say they can't get where they come from. They do a lot of coke and are very wonderful about the whole range of things." "Do they?" said Arthur. "Are they? So, when is this then? When do they come? He gazed out at the Pacific as well. There were little sandpipers running along the margin of the shore, which seemed to have this problem. They needed to find their food in the sand, which a wave had just washed over, but they couldn't bear to get their feet wet. To deal with this problem, they ran with an odd kind of movement, as if they'd been constructed by somebody very clever in Switzerland. Fenchurch was sitting on the sand, idly drawing patterns in it with her fingers. Weekends, mostly, said Wonko the Sane, on little scooters. They are great machines. He smiled. I see, said Arthur. I see. A tiny cough from Fenchurch attracted his attention, and he looked around at her. He had scratched a little stick figure. She had scratched a little stick figure drawing into the sand of the two of them in the clouds. For a moment, he thought she was trying to get him excited, and then he realized she was rebuking him. Who are we, she was saying, to say he's mad? His house was certainly peculiar, and since this was the first thing that Fenchurch and Arthur had encountered, it would help to know what it was like. It was like this. It was inside out. Actually inside out, to the extent that they had had to park on the carpet. All along what one would normally call the outer wall, which was decorated in tasteful interior designed pink, were bookshelves. Also a couple of those odd three-legged tables with semicircular tops which stand in such a way as to suggest that someone just dropped the wall straight through them, and pictures which were clearly designed to soothe. Where it got really odd was the roof. It folded back on itself like something that M.C. Escher, had he been given to hard nights on the town, which it is no part of this narrative's purpose to suggest was the case, though it is sometimes hard, looking at his pictures, particularly the one with all the awkward steps, not to wonder, might have dreamed up after having been on one. For the little chandeliers, which should have been hanging inside, were on the outside, pointing up. Confusing. The sign above the front door read, "Come outside," and so nervously they had. Inside, of course, was where the outside was. Rough brickwork, nicely done pointing, gutters in good repair, a garden path, a couple of small trees, some rooms leading off. And the inner walls stretched down, folded curiously, and opened at the end as if by an optical illusion which would have had M.C. Escher frowning and wondering how it was done, to enclose the Pacific Ocean itself. Hello, said John Watson, Wonko the Sane. Good, they thought to themselves. Hello is something we can cope with. Hello, they said, and all, surprisingly, was smiles. For quite a while, they seemed curiously reluctant to talk about the dolphins, looking oddly distracted and saying, I forget, whenever they were mentioned, and had shown them quite proudly round the eccentricities of his house. It gives me pleasure, he said, in a curious kind of way, and does nobody any harm, he continued, that a competent optician couldn't correct. They liked him. He had an open, engaging quality and seemed able to mock himself before anybody else did. Your wife, said Arthur, looking around, mentioned some toothpicks. He said it with a hunted look, as if he was worried that she might suddenly leap out from behind a door and mention them again. Wonko the Sane laughed. It was a light, easy laugh, and sounded like one he had used a lot before and was happy with. Ah, yes, he said. That's to do with the day I finally realized that the world had gone totally mad and built the asylum to put it in, poor thing, and hoped it would get better. That was the point at which Arthur began to feel a little nervous again. Here, said Wonko the Sane, we are outside the asylum. He pointed again at the rough brickwork, the pointing, and the gutters. Go through that door, he pointed at the first door through which they had originally entered, and you go into the asylum. I've tried to decorate it nicely to keep the inmates happy, but there's very little one can do. I never go in there myself. If ever I am tempted, which these days I rarely am, I simply look at the sign written over the door and I shy away. That one, said Fenchurch, pointing, rather puzzled, at a blue plaque with some instructions written on it. Yes, they are the words that finally turned me into the hermit I have now become. It was quite sudden. I saw them, and I knew what I had to do. The sign read, Hold stick near center of its length. Moisten pointed end in mouth. Insert in tooth space, blunt end next to gum. Use gentle in-out motion. It seemed to me, said Wonko the Sane, that any civilization that had so far lost its head as to need to include a set of detailed instructions for use in a package of toothpicks was no longer a civilization in which I could live and stay sane. He gazed out at the Pacific Ocean, as if daring it to rave and gibber at him, but it lay there calmly and played with the sandpipers. And in case it crossed your mind to wonder, as I can see how it possibly might, I am completely sane, which is why I call myself Wonko the Sane, just to reassure people on this point. Wonko is what my mother called me when I was a kid. I'm clumsy and knock things over, and sane is what I am, and how. He added with one of the smiles that made you feel, oh, well, that's all right then. I intend to remain. Shall we go to the beach and see what we have to talk about? They went out onto the beach, which was where he started talking about angels with golden beards and green wings and Dr. Scholl's sandals. About the dolphins, said Fenchurch gently, hopefully. I can show you the sandals, said Wonko the Sane. I wonder, do you know... Would you like me to show you, said Wonko the Sane, the sandals? I have them. I'll get them. They are made by the Dr. Scholl Company, and the angels say that they particularly suit the terrain they have to work in. They say they run a concession stand by the message. When I say I don't know what that means, they say, no, you don't, and laugh. Well, I'll get them anyway. As he walked back toward the inside, or the outside, depending on how you looked at it, Arthur and Fenchurch looked at each other in a wonderingly and slightly desperate sort of way. Then each shrugged and idly drew figures in the sand. How are your feet today? Said Arthur quietly. Oh, it doesn't feel so odd in the sand, or in the water. The water touches them perfectly. I just think this isn't our world. She shrugged. What do you think he meant by the message? I don't know, said Arthur, though the memory of a man called Prack, who laughed at him continuously, kept nagging at him. When Wonko returned, he was carrying something that stunned Arthur. Not the sandals. They were perfectly ordinary wooden-bottomed sandals. I just thought you'd like to see, he said, what angels wear on their feet. Just out of curiosity. I'm not trying to prove anything, by the way. I'm a scientist, and I know what constitutes proof. But the reason I call myself by my childhood name is to remind myself that a scientist must also be absolutely like a child. If he sees a thing, he must say that he sees it, whether it was what he thought he was going to see or not. See first, think later, then test. But always see first. Otherwise, you will only see what you were expecting. Most scientists forget that. I'll show you something to demonstrate that later. So the other reason I call myself Wonko the Sane is so that people will think I am a fool. That allows me to say what I see when I see it. You can't possibly be a scientist if you mind people thinking that you're a fool. Anyway, I also thought you might like to see this. This was the thing that Arthur had been stunned to see him carrying, for it was a wonderfully silver-gray glass fishbowl, seemingly identical to the one in Arthur's bedroom. Arthur had been trying for some 30 seconds now, without success, to say, Where did you get that? Sharply, and with a gasp in his voice. Finally, his time had come, but he missed it by a millisecond. Where did you get that? Said Fenchurch, sharply and with a gasp in her voice. Arthur glanced at Fenchurch sharply and with a gasp in his voice. Said, What? Have you seen one of these before? Yes, she said. I've got one. Or at least I did have. Russell stole it to put his golf balls in. I don't know where it came from, just that I was angry with Russell for stealing it. Why, have you got one? Yes, it was... They both became aware that Wonko the Sane was glancing sharply and back and forward between them and trying to get a gasp in edgeways. You have one of these too? He said to both of them. Yes, they both said it. He looked long and calmly at each of them. Then he held up the bowl to catch the light of the California sun. The bowl seemed almost to sing with the sun, to chime with the intensity of its light, and cast darkly brilliant rainbows around the sand and upon them. He turned it and turned it. They could see quite clearly in the fine tracery of its etchwork the words, So long, and thanks for all the fish. Do you know, said Wonko quietly. What it is? They shook their heads slowly and with wonder, almost hypnotized by the flashing of the lightning shadows in the gray glass. It's a farewell gift from the dolphins, said Wonko in a low, quiet voice. The dolphins, whom I loved and studied and swam with, and fed with fish, and even tried to learn their language, a task which they seemed to make impossibly difficult, considering the fact that I now realize they were perfectly capable of communicating in ours if they decided they wanted to. He shook his head with a slow, slow smile, and then looked again at Fenchurch, and then at Arthur. Have you, he said to Arthur, what have you done with yours? May I ask you that? I kept a fish in it, said Arthur, slightly embarrassed. I happened to have this fish I was wondering what to do with, and, there was this bowl. He tailed off. You've done nothing else? No, he said. If you had, you would know. He shook his head again. My wife kept wheat germ in ours, resumed Wonko, with some new tone in his voice, until last night. What, said Arthur slowly and hushedly, happened last night? We ran out of wheat germ, said Wonko evenly. My wife has gone to get some more. He seemed lost with his own thoughts for a moment. And what happened then? Said Fenchurch in the same breathless tone. I washed it, said Wonko. I washed it very carefully, very, very carefully, removing every last speck of wheat germ. Then I dried it slowly with a lint-free cloth, slowly, carefully, turning it over and over. Then I held it to my ear. Have you held one to your ear? They both shook their heads, again, slowly, again, dumbly. Perhaps, he said, you should.